The SUNY College of Environmental Science and Forestry, founded in 1911, is now the only institution of higher learning in the United States dedicated solely to the study of natural resources and the environment.
Salt marshes are extremely beneficial to our environment. They're one of the most biologically productive habitats on the planet. They also often serve as a transition between land and water, but they're sometimes treated simply as wastelands. The SUNY College of Environmental Science and Forestry is working to restore Onondaga Lake's inland salt marshes to contain runoff from the Solvay settling basins and create an eco-friendly habitat.
We need to do everything we can to minimize additional input of pollutants into Onondaga Lake, and we think that this is a very reasonable, relatively cheap way to be a part of that process.
And welcome to Improve Your World with SUNY ESF. I'm your host, Don Torrance. And you just heard from him. He's here joining us now. Dr. Don Leopold is heading up SUNY ESF's effort to restore the salt marshes around Onondaga Lake. Dr. Leopold, we welcome you.
Thank you.
I'd like to start out with just some of the basics, first of all, so people understand the terms we're discussing here. Restoration means what as compared to mitigation or any of the other terms that have to do with how we deal with the salt marsh environment?
Mitigation is usually used in a broader sense. It includes not just restoring a landscape, but a lot of other measures can be included. When we talk about restoration, we're talking about bringing back something as it once was.
Mm-hmm. More to its natural state, as we
Ideally.
Right. If you could emphasize, we talked about this a little bit in the introduction to the show, the importance of these systems, however, for all of us, and why it would relate to people out there who are wondering, well, what do I need to know about this for?
Well, the places we're trying to bring these once common, now very rare communities are not able to support a lot of different plant species. So we're looking at this from a number of angles. One is that the plant species we're focusing on are ideally suited to some very difficult conditions, very saline, very high in salt, very high in pH. We're also interested in doing this because these plant communities once occupied a fair amount of central New York, especially around the lake, and they've been wiped out. And they happen to be some of the most globally significant communities, plant communities in the eastern United States. So we want to bring them back for that reason as well.
So there's a special quality about them that perhaps the people who came here earlier and put industry and the like around the lake didn't really understand or appreciate.
Well, we know that salt is a part of our natural heritage here in Syracuse, and we know of products like salt potatoes that came about from the early discovery of the salt springs. But those salt springs, as they released their water, created a large number of salt marshes that on the East Coast are not unusual, but they're very unusual in central New York where there is no tidal influence.
It seems to me most people are probably familiar with the tidal salt marshes or wetlands, whatever term is used in any particular area. Certainly when we go to the beach, we go through an estuary area or a wetland area of that kind. How significantly different are these salt marshes that you're working with, inland salt marshes, as you call them?
Some of the species are identical. Some of the species, there are probably different genotypes of the ones that occur in central New York. Some of the species are unique to central New York, so it's a different assemblage of species. They're much more diverse, and for many of these species, they occur nowhere else inland in the United States except for these very few inland salt marshes.
So they are precious indeed.
Yes.
What are the other functions then? There's an important concern, obviously, about the quality of the water in Onondaga Lake. There's a huge effort to try to improve that, perhaps bring it back to its original pristine state, if that's even possible. What role do these marshes play in that?
Well, without a plant cover, the material that has all kinds of materials in that are not desirable, we have a tendency to wash into the lake or into streams that wash into the lake. This vegetative cover really provides that protection from that erosion, minimizes the water that moves through these places that eventually ends up into the larger water systems like Onondaga Lake. So it's this vegetative cover that provides a critical ecological function.
Okay. And you're able to measure that with the sites that you're working with now?
We are. We started planting a couple of years ago, and more recently we're starting to assess the ecological function, especially the evapotranspiration, the amount of water that is lost by the plant, either through physiological processes or simple evaporation from the plant surfaces.
Now, if we can go back and talk a little bit then about some of the species that are represented here. I know some of them are very near and dear to you, and we do have some video and photos of them. One of them is this aster plant. Can you describe what this is and the role it plays in the salt marsh?
You know, a lot of folks in New York know about asters and goldenrods because they're very common in old fields this time of year, and they're usually very big and very bright. And this was an aster that I'd never seen before, and we were out a couple years ago walking Onondaga Lake, walking along the lake shore, and we found not just one, we found about 5,000. This happens to be one of the rarest plants in New York. It's confined to Long Island, and here we find 5,000 of them in Syracuse. So it's an annual, which is another unusual trait. They're usually perennial. So we took a lot of seeds, we've propagated it, and we're actually planting these now on the waste beds as part of our vegetative trials.
And I think we do have some video and photos too of the plantings that are going on there. What exactly is the effort here then? We see these are different sorts of plants. How do you choose what to plant and where to plant them?
Well, we wanted to pick species that were once known to Central New York, even though we don't currently know of some locations for them. And we've bought these plants from suppliers who grow a lot of these salt marsh species, although not for inland salt marsh restoration. So we had to find a supplier that had reliable material, good material. And we've planted probably over nearly 100 species of trees and shrubs and grass-like plants and herbaceous plants in these trials over the waste beds.
And how do you know the ratio? How do you know how many to plant and the precise places where they might thrive, or is that part of what you're trying to discover?
We're doing these on a very small scale right now, and so the spacing right now isn't as critical as finding out which plants will grow and how much do they grow. So this past month, the PhD student working on this project, really responsible for the data collection, Tony Leonardo, he has spent the last 2 months taking the plants that have been growing for 2 years and cutting all of the above ground portion and measuring that, weighing that, and then the worst part is pulling up the roots and measuring the below ground biomass, so we have a very good measurement of how successful these plants are.
Okay, what is the next step then? What remains to be done in terms of restoring this marsh and continuing with your measurements?
Well, the next step is to take what we're doing on a meter square basis, roughly a yard by a yard basis, and seeing if we can apply it to 5 or 10 or 15 acres. And if that works, then we're going to try to scale it up to much larger areas along the lake shore. But we first have to go from this very experimental small scale basis to a larger scale.
And will the results of your research have an impact on how this is carried forward? I know obviously this has to ultimately get into the political realm in terms of funding and the state and federal government's commitment to restoring Onondaga Lake. Will this be an important part of that?
Well, we think so. I mean, you can restore wetlands much more simply, and you can do it much more generically. And what we're trying to do is not suggest this is the only way to go as an alternative, but here's a way to make these restored wetlands much more diversified than they typically are.
Well, this is terrific. We look forward to perhaps following up with you to see what the results are down the road.
Yeah, look forward to that.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Leopold.
Thank you.
And Dr. Leopold did mention Tony Leonardo, one of the graduate students, and we're going to have some information about the work that he's been up to in our next segment.
So what we've got here are two species that are a key component of our prairie ecosystems, and that's the this is a big blue stem, or Andropogon girardii, and then we've got the Indian grass here, Sargassum nutans. And these two species can both tolerate quite a bit of dry conditions, also fairly alkaline conditions. And another key component that these plants have are big, robust root systems, again, to hold this bank in place. This is a dune. This species right here is what you'd find on dunes, and this is the American beach grass, or it's called Ammophila breviligulata. And again, this species' main function is it can tolerate very poor, infertile conditions while also attaining pretty good growth. And again, it grows outward under the ground fairly rapidly to stabilize the dunes. This is called the Panicum amarum, or bitter panic grass. It's native to the coast, the coastal areas of New York State. And the main thing that this will have as it grows is a nice big grass, but also this glaucous bluish gray color, so it'll look really nice out here, if you can imagine it swaying in the breeze. As we start to move down into this depression area, these areas here were historically where the leachate from the landfill had salinized some of these soils. So what we're thinking about down here and what we're applying is then inland salt marsh plants to this area, because they're, one, highly stress tolerant, can tolerate the salts, but also develop, again, fairly vigorous outward growth to stabilize the site. So we're talking, this plant here is a nice example of that. This is a prairie cordgrass. This is called spike grass, or Disticus spicata, and it can tolerate salinities up to about twice as salty as seawater. So it's a really tough little grass. But what it'll do, it'll grow about this tall, and mainly what it'll do is it'll grow outward again through these runners that'll go above ground, hold the soil in place, suck up any leachate water that's in the area. And another nice trait is that it doesn't, since it's low growing down along this front edge here, the site managers don't have to worry about mowing it or doing much with it other than just letting it grow. What we have behind us is the old collection ditch for the leachate that was leaving the site, and you can see all the salts precipitated in the ditch. And a lot of these areas here out in front of me are also similarly affected by the salt. So then what we've got planted all through this depression area here are plants from inland salt marsh communities, such as spike grass. This here is prairie cordgrass, more spike grass in through here. And again, this soil that I'm standing on right here is, at this point in time, nearly twice as saline as salt water. So it's incredibly salty. Add to that the heat, the lack of rain, the wind that whips through here, the intense sunlight. This is a really challenging community for these plants to tolerate. As we move through this community, we start to work uphill and out of the salt, more saline conditions, but we run into another problem, and that is the slope, where again the soil is going to want to wash off and move downhill. So we've planted dune stabilizing species, again, to hold this in place, but also they're adapted to the lack of water that will likely occur here. And as we move farther upslope, we haven't planted this yet, but the crew is working this way, and what we're going to be putting in up here, again, our prairie species, or limestone prairie species, again, highly stress tolerant, drought tolerant, that can, but with big robust root systems to hold this soil in place and up here.
You can improve your world by what you plant in your yard. It is commonly believed that invasive species arrived in the U.S. accidentally. Not so, according to a study by the Brooklyn Botanic Garden. They found that half of the worst invasive plant species were brought here intentionally for horticultural use. Gardening with native species is an effective way to deal with this problem. ESF's Improve Your World website has helped to find the right trees and plants.
You just can't put one species out over the whole place because the water depth will vary, and every species has a very distinct reaction to the water depths.
And I'm joined now by Professor Douglas Daly, who's the ecological engineer for the SUNY ESF Salt Marsh Restoration Project. Doug, thanks for joining us.
Hi, Don. Nice to be here.
I want to start out by actually taking a look at a shot from the site. So I guess it's sort of a pedestrian way to put it, but you're involved basically with the plumbing of this site. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, it's fair to say that's a pedestrian way to put it, yes.
Okay. Well, we'll start with that premise then. And tell us exactly what it is that we're looking at here. We have an understanding now from our previous interview with Dr. Leopold about the plants and the role of the salt marsh. But what precisely do we seem to see three different elements here, kind of upshore, almost upland element, then a gravelly trough of some sort, and then more downhill plantings that are closer to the water source itself. Can you describe each of them and what they do?
Yeah, actually what you're looking at here, all the action is taking place underground, and you're looking at what's called an interceptor trench. The dark object there in the background is the manhole, or the way that you access the pipe that's buried in there and surrounded by that gravel. Mm-hmm. What's coming from upland, or the upslope area, is the leachate coming out of the waste bed. We capture the leachate in this gravel drain system and convey that down to a central collection point. That way we can keep it under control and keep it from sort of diffusing out to the environment in an uncontrolled way.
Another simple analogy perhaps for people to understand, is this akin to a French drain system that you might put around the foundation of your house?
It's exactly a French drain system. It's to intercept the flow of water either across the shallow surface or a little bit deeper, just a few feet down, and catches that water. And water's going to flow the easiest path that it can, and so we just provide easy paths for that water to follow.
Now, on this downslope side, closer to the watershed itself, what's the function of this planted area here?
Two functions primarily. One is to keep the soils in place, keep them from washing away or blowing away in the wind. The other is to provide a little bit of habitat for some of the wildlife in the area. And actually there's a third function, which is some of the water that lands there, the plants will take up through transpiration process. It'll evaporate, and that's another way that we can control the water in this landfill area by moving the water back to the atmosphere before it comes into contact with the waste materials.
Now, the critical thing for you, or one of them I would imagine, is measuring the effectiveness of this. This qualifies as a test site at this point, or are you fairly confident that this is working the way you want it to?
Well, I believe this particular application is working the way it was intended to, which is let's move the water, move a lot of water, move a lot of water quickly through that drain system. The other part of this project, which is still kind of a test, is to see how the vegetation is surviving and what type of vegetation survives.
So you might alter, for instance, this area of vegetation that's closer to the watershed if you find that different species will do better?
That's exactly right. That's what my colleagues in biology are working on. So as the engineer, I've got certain performance standards that I like to see met, and the biologists help me identify what plants and soils will help do that.
Okay. Now, is this something, if indeed it does work to the level you hope it will, and it apparently is, that we could see all along critical watersheds, not just here in central New York, but elsewhere? And if so, that seems like a fairly large engineering job.
Well, this is one way of controlling the water. I'm involved in another aspect on this site where we're using large plantings of willow to move the water, so it looks less engineered than this particular project site does.
In other words, more natural?
More natural, yeah. But as an ecological engineer, we try to work with the environment, work with the ecosystems to optimize what they already do and help them do it a little better, we hope.
Well, that actually leads to my next question. We talked a little bit earlier about the difference between restoration and mitigation, and how does this replicate what would happen naturally before man came and altered this particular environment? Is that a fair question?
That's absolutely fair question. How does this?
In other words,
I'm trying to figure out where you're going with
this. This seems like a very human-engineered kind of idea, but I'm wondering if it was inspired by anything that would have been here naturally before the site had been tampered with by humans.
A little bit, but it's also, we have to remind ourselves that we're responding to situations that humans created, which weren't there naturally. So we are kind of replicating in this particular case. You're replicating a hill slope draining down to a valley. Most of the valleys here in central New York have sand and gravel that the streams flow through, and the groundwater flows through sand and gravel a lot easier.
Now, one thing we didn't discuss is once the water does drain, you said it went to a waste treatment facility. Is that a municipal facility, or is this something that you've created solely for this project?
In this particular case, at this location, the water is going to a municipal treatment facility. At other locations, we're hoping to collect the water, put it into a wetland, and provide opportunities for the natural process of evaporation to take place.
So you might do some combination of both, but...
Yeah, I think these systems are only going to work best if we make them systems, if we have lots of components that are redundant to each other in some cases, like natural systems have a lot of redundancy built into them.
Is there a problem with acquiring land use rights for these sorts of systems? If, for instance, you needed a fairly major engineering effort to improve the whole water system, are you getting cooperation? Is that an issue that would come up down the line? And if so, eminent domain, for instance, would that be something that would have to come into play?
Yeah, that's a little bit outside of what I've been addressing,
Right.
so I haven't encountered that yet. This is a big enough site that we're not worried about that.
The size of this one is large enough for your purposes in
Yep.
research.
Yep.
And then ultimately you would take these results, or someone would, and then try to convince the powers that be that this is a way to go.
Right.
And let the politics play out later on. That, Professor Doug Daly, thanks very much for joining us. And we'll be right back after this.
You can improve your world by learning more about it. From black bears in the Adirondacks to the restoration of Atlantic salmon in Lake Ontario and its tributaries, and the growing number of coyotes all across the state, SUNY ESF offers details in its Environmental Information Series. Do we need to encourage growth or curtail it? Get the facts, then you decide. There's also advice for developing environmentally sensitive landscapes, how to test your soil pH, and what it means.
Welcome back to Improve Your World with SUNY ESF. I'm joined now by ESF graduate student Danielle Bonatti. Danielle, thanks for joining us at this. Fascinating topic. We understand that you're really into some of the detail work with regard to this restoration project of the salt marsh. Tell us specifically what you're focusing in on and what particular plant species you've been dealing with.
Right now we're working with shrub willow at the Solvay Wastebed 13 and developing an alternative evapotranspiration cover system. And I'm working with modeling the water balance of that site and using a model to predict the future percolation through the landfill cover cap.
We're going to ask you to explain a couple of those.
Okay.
First, when you say an alternative, is that the alternative to the species, for instance, Dr. Leopold was speaking of earlier, that are more native species?
No, alternative meaning alternative to conventional covers.
Okay. And shrub willow we've heard an awful lot about. Matter of fact, we've done some previous programs about that. It seems to be a pretty versatile plant, and I guess it's a good one for you to study. Why is that?
Willows have extreme amounts of water holding capacity, so they're able to take up a lot of water and move water very efficiently and effectively.
So that's what you're trying to determine, the balance of runoff water, what they take up, what they transpire, and how that affects ultimately the downstream watershed?
Yep.
Okay. And how big an experiment is this at this point? How much acreage, and where are you in the
there's about 3 willow plantings, 3 field sites, and they're about 1 acre about in size. One we just started a couple years ago with different biosolids and amendments, so that one's fairly new, but the other ones have been going on for a couple years now.
And does it seem promising? Does this look like a plant that's worthy of continued study?
Yes, very promising. Yep, they're doing well out on the waste beds. You've probably seen the different pictures and things of all the willows, but they're growing pretty well out there.
Now, the other discussions we've had about this plant had to do with harvesting them, actually, and using them for biofuel and things of that sort. Would that be something that this would be, in other words, a kind of a holistic approach to planting and using these plants for both for remediation and restoration, and also ultimately as perhaps a fuel source or something?
Yeah, that's the plan. Since it is a short rotation crop,
Right.
It would be available for harvest every 3 years, I think it is. As well as in the middle being a cover system and water movement source.
Very versatile then.
Yeah.
Now, what else does it do well? We've talked a little bit about the sort of filtering process that plants can give, especially if there are contaminants or pollutants coming from runoff and the like. Is the willow an effective filter in that regard?
Yeah, willows can be used for filters, but in this application we're mainly focusing on the water balance, the water movement of the willows, since they are planted on so much waste. So we're not focused really with remediating the waste, more as moving the water.
Okay. And what happens once you find this to be most effective, especially with regard to what we'd seen earlier with some of the different kind of plant species that are going along? Is there some sort of coming together of minds to determine where it's most appropriate for this kind of plant versus another kind of plant?
Yeah, every site is pretty much specific to what sort of plant you choose to use and application. So it's basically on a site per site basis when you determine what kind of cap you want to use and what kind of plants to put on that site.
And the term cap you describe as the plantings, basically.
Yeah, the
They're
alternative.
providing the kind of natural cap.
Yes.
Okay.
Yep.
So the shrub willow, what species are you using? Is it a fairly standard one, or is it one that you've had to import from somewhere else?
It's a fairly standard Salix willow. I'm not exactly sure of the clone and everything, but the clones have been tested by people in biology, and the ones that have worked the best and showed the most promise have been used on the site so far.
Okay, so what's a typical day like out there for you? Are you out
For
there
me?
pulling up plants and?
No, I go out there and measure soil moisture, and so a couple of days a week or every month I go out and measure soil moisture and go through the willows and just different depths, measure the soil moisture at various clones and various applications, biosolid applications, different ones that measure the soil moisture. I also work with some other graduate students and help them with their projects out there as well. Yakinet Merck is doing sat flow measurements, so we're out there measuring the sat flow of the willows and putting the different sat flow sensors on each tree, so that's time consuming. But yeah.
Now, on a day like this, it's just begun to rain again outside. Is that something that has an influence over how often you have to go out there?
Yeah, every time also after it rains, we go and collect water that has passed through the willows to see how much has come through the canopy. But usually the rain doesn't affect where we go out all the time anyways, rain or shine.
Right, and it's been a kind of dry summer here in central New York,
Yeah.
so, but your work goes on.
Yep,
obviously.
work goes on.
So what would be next for you? Is this going to be part of your PhD thesis at some point?
No, this is my master's thesis for now. Okay. We'll see about the PhD a little later, but for now this is my master's thesis, and hopefully I'll be graduated in May with some exciting results on the willow.
Well, it's
cap.
certainly an exciting area because a lot of people are working in this, and the work is good work, and we'll have to see how it all comes together. This integration of ecological engineering and biology and plants and animals.
Yeah.
Thank you very much
Thank
for joining us, Danielle.
Thank you very
we
much.
appreciate it.
And that'll do it for this edition of Improve Your World with SUNY ESF. I'm your host, Don Torrance, and we look forward to seeing you next time.